There's a moment in the day when everything looks calm on the outside, but something itches on the inside, like a door left slightly open in an empty room. No wind, no movement, just that. You try to move on, keep walking, but a part of you is still explaining, defending things no one even asked about, replaying conversations that ended hours ago, writing imaginary replies to people who never listened in the first place. You feel the need to clarify, to justify, to be understood, as if being misunderstood meant you failed at something important. But what if I told you that this itch, this invisible tension, is not about them? It's about you, and the part of you that hasn't yet made peace with simply being. We live surrounded by noise, but some of the loudest noise comes from the inside. The need to explain, to be accepted, to prove you're not wrong, not foolish, not weak. But who gave them the power to define your strength? And when did silence become a thing to fear? You weren't born justifying yourself. You learned to, somewhere between being misunderstood and punished for being different. Somewhere between, why are you like this? And you should have known better. And now, every room you walk into feels like a courtroom. Every silence feels dangerous. So you fill it with more words, more versions of yourself, more stories to sound acceptable. But here's the thing. Every time you explain yourself to be accepted, you're also teaching your nervous system that your truth is not enough, that your essence needs subtitles, and that's where you begin to fracture. Not because others reject you, but because you keep translating yourself to be tolerated. There's a quiet violence in constantly needing to be understood. It erodes your roots, weakens your spine, and eventually, you start apologizing for your own existence without even realizing it. But there is another way, a way that doesn't scream, doesn't defend, doesn't chase permission, just presence, just peace, just truth, untranslated. If any part of this feels familiar, you're not broken, you're just tired of explaining, of shrinking, of asking the world for a kind of love it doesn't know how to give. So, don't. Let's begin again. In silence, you wake up. It's still dark outside. The world hasn't asked anything of you yet, but already you feel the weight, the pressure to perform, to explain why you didn't respond, why you changed your mind, why you need space, and you haven't even spoken a word. This is the silent war most people never talk about, the constant defense of your own boundaries, as if they're crimes. It starts in small moments. You say no, and immediately feel the urge to soften it, to explain, to cushion the truth. You cancel a plan and type 3 extra messages to make sure they don't get the wrong idea. But what if they do? What if they misunderstand? What if they think you're selfish, cold, distant? And what if that's none of your business? There's a strange kind of freedom in letting people be wrong about you, not out of pride, but out of peace. Because if you bend yourself every time someone doesn't understand, eventually you forget what your original shape was. You stop being and start performing. You dress your truth in costume so others can clap. But what happens when no one's watching? What happens when the applause stops? If your peace depends on being understood, you're still a prisoner, and you'll feel it in your chest, in the tension behind your eyes, in the way your breath shortens every time you choose silence and then betray it with over-explaining. This isn't just emotional, it's physiological. Your body remembers every moment you wanted to trust your voice, but edited yourself to be digestible. And now, even your nervous system is tired. Tired of asking for permission to take up space. Tired of apologizing for simply existing differently. So, the real question becomes, who are you when you stop defending? What remains when you stop performing the safe version of yourself? This is not about becoming rude. It's about becoming real. Some truths don't need an audience. Some choices don't need explanations. And some peace only arrives when you're brave enough to be misunderstood. Let them misinterpret. Let them assume. Let them project. You owe no one a version of yourself that you don't believe in. Start here, with this breath, this silence, this refusal to explain something that already feels true within you, not out of arrogance, but out of alignment. Some people call it overthinking, but it's deeper than that. It's self-surveillance. A quiet, constant need to monitor how you're being perceived. You walk into a room, and before your mouth opens, your mind already whispers, "Be careful. Don't say too much. Make sure they like you." And so, you start adjusting the tone of your voice, the posture of your body, the rhythm of your speech, not because you want to, but because you've been conditioned to believe that safety equals acceptance. And acceptance? It always feels like it needs maintenance. You perform. You smile when something hurts. You laugh when something bothers you. You explain, even when no one asked, because silence feels dangerous, like a risk you can't afford, like a mirror reflecting your truth back at you, and wondering if you're ready to own it. But what if the danger was never in being silent, but in never being whole? What if all that explaining is just a beautiful mask for a deeper fear, that if you stop talking, people might see who you really are? And what if that's exactly what you need? Most people don't realize that self-betrayal rarely shows up in big events. It lives in the details. It's in the way you reword your truth to sound softer, in the way you hesitate before disagreeing, in the apology you add, even when you know you've done nothing wrong. It's in the "I just wanted to say" and the "hope that's okay." It's in the smile you fake to keep the peace outside, while chaos brews inside. We've learned to package ourselves for consumption, speak in templates, feel in doses, exist in versions. But the truth is, you weren't made to be a version. You were made to be whole. And sometimes, wholeness looks like someone who no longer explains why they walked away, why they said no, why they chose rest. Sometimes wholeness sounds like a breath, a pause, a gaze that doesn't flinch. There is a dignity in not defending your life, in choosing to walk quietly, even when the world demands a statement, because real power is not in what you can justify. It's in what you can leave unsaid and still feel grounded. So ask yourself, without judgment, what part of you is still seeking approval disguised as explanation? And is it worth it? The anxiety, the self-editing, the delay in your becoming. You don't owe the world your clarity. You owe yourself your alignment. You don't need to rehearse your boundaries. Just honor them. Not with drama, not with anger, but with quiet, steady presence. Because the more you explain, the more you train yourself to believe your truth is not enough. And if you do that long enough, you won't just lose your voice. You'll forget the sound of it. Today is a good day to stop. There's a difference between explaining and expressing. Explaining is a performance, a negotiation, an attempt to shape perception. Expressing is a release, a truth offered without demand. You can feel it in the body. Explaining feels tight, a tension in the chest, a slight rush of urgency behind the eyes. Expressing feels calm, centered, like setting something down instead of throwing it across the room, hoping someone will catch it right. And yet, so many of us confuse the two. We think we're being honest when we're just being afraid. Afraid of being seen wrongly, afraid of being misread, afraid of not being liked by people who don't even know themselves. But what if misunderstanding is not the enemy? What if it's a filter that reveals who truly sees you and who only sees their own projections? The Stoics taught us that our peace comes not from others, but from what we choose to believe about ourselves. You can live a whole life chasing explanations, offering justifications, polishing your image like a fragile sculpture, and still feel empty the moment you're alone. Because no amount of approval can replace the solidity of self-trust. And that's what this is really about. Not communication, not politeness, but self-trust. The person who trusts themselves doesn't over-explain. Not because they're better, but because they've realized that life is too short to spend it constantly defending a soul that is already whole. You don't need a PowerPoint for your choices. You don't need footnotes for your boundaries. You don't need emotional receipts for every no you say. There's a kind of clarity that only comes when you stop talking, not out of fear, but out of fullness. You realize that silence doesn't mean weakness. It means you're listening to something deeper than noise. Your intuition, your alignment, your integrity. Let others misunderstand. Let the room fall quiet after your truth. Let the tension breathe. You don't need to fix their discomfort. You don't need to make yourself smaller so others can stay comfortable. You were not born to fit into every room. You were born to stand in your own. And when you do, you'll notice something. People who respect truth don't need explanations. They recognize it in the way you walk, the way you hold your silence, the way you choose stillness over spectacle. So today, try it. Say less, mean more, and let the silence speak for you. Today, we name it. Not to label, but to see it clearly, so it no longer hides in the shadows. The habit is this: over-explaining, a subtle addiction to being understood at all costs, a quiet desperation to be seen as good, reasonable, justified. It sounds innocent until you realize how much of your life has been shaped by it, how many choices you twisted to seem acceptable, how many truths you watered down so they'd go down easier, how many times you gave reasons for doing what was already right for you, as if your intuition needed permission to exist. Let's be honest. Over-explaining is not about honesty. It's about fear. Fear of being rejected, fear of being misunderstood, fear of seeming cold or selfish or worse, hard to love. But that fear, it costs you. Because every time you explain yourself just to feel safe, you send a message to your nervous system: I am only allowed to exist if others agree with me. And slowly, quietly, you build a prison with invisible bars made of other people's comfort. But here's the truth: you are not responsible for how others receive your peace. You are not responsible for making your boundaries pretty or your truth palatable. You are only responsible for being rooted in your center and living from it. This is not about being rude, it's about being whole. It's about knowing the difference between connection and performance. Because connection doesn't need a script. It doesn't require 1,000 explanations to prove your heart is good. Real connection sees you even in silence. So what happens when you stop explaining? When you stop defending the parts of you that never needed defense in the first place? You meet yourself, finally. Not the version you edited, not the version you polished, but the version that stands without leaning on permission. And from that place, everything shifts. You begin to walk differently, speak slower, decide with less noise, because you realize that you're no longer trying to be liked, you're choosing to be aligned. You're no longer proving, you're simply being. And there's power in that, quiet power, the kind that doesn't beg, doesn't argue, doesn't explain. It just exists, fully, unapologetically, peacefully. So today, call it what it is, and let it go. You don't need to explain yourself to be real. You just need to be honest enough to stop. There's a silence that's heavier than noise, not the silence of absence, but the silence that comes when you finally stop performing. At first it feels strange, unfamiliar, like walking barefoot after years in tight shoes. You're not used to the freedom, not used to the stillness that doesn't demand explanation. But slowly you begin to hear things that were buried under the noise. You hear your intuition, the quiet knowing that was always there, but drowned out by the need to be approved. You hear your breath, fuller, slower, no longer racing to meet a version of yourself you never chose. And in that silence, you realize something profound. You were never meant to be constantly understood, because true understanding doesn't come from explanation, it comes from presence. And not everyone has the capacity to meet you there. You've been trying to build bridges to places that don't want to receive you, watering yourself down just to fit into containers that were never meant to hold your depth. But the soul knows. It knows when it's shrinking. It knows when it's performing. It knows when it's lying just to stay liked. And every time you explain yourself out of fear, you chip away at that knowing. You trade clarity for comfort, but it's not real comfort, just the illusion of safety. Temporary peace in exchange for long-term fracture. So what if you stopped? What if the next time someone questioned you, you didn't scramble to prove your worth? What if you let your no stand as it is, not as a starting point for negotiation, but as a boundary? Would it feel uncomfortable? Yes. But discomfort is not danger, it's just unfamiliar strength. The Stoics taught us that virtue lives in action, not in performance. You don't need to decorate your truth to make it valuable. It already is. Let that truth settle. Let it speak without armor. Let it breathe without panic. You are not responsible for teaching others how to handle your silence. And if they demand explanations to respect you, they were never offering real respect. Real respect doesn't beg for evidence. It listens, it trusts. It doesn't require footnotes to believe in your wholeness. So today, practice the art of being still in the face of expectation, not as a weapon, not as a wall, but as a quiet declaration. I know who I am, and I no longer trade that for temporary comfort. That kind of silence doesn't just protect you, it rebuilds you. One decision at a time, one unspoken truth at a time, one sacred refusal to over-explain what already lives fully inside you. You've probably noticed there's a moment right after you speak your truth where everything feels exposed. A pause, a silence, a sharp awareness of having said too little, or maybe too much. That's the moment most people rush to fill. They panic. They rewind, they repackage their words to sound less raw, more acceptable. But what if you didn't? What if you sat in that silence and let it be what it is? Uncomfortable, yes, but honest. You see, over-explaining is not always verbal. It's energetic. It's the fidgeting, the apologizing for your tone, the nervous laughter after stating something clear. It's the body asking for forgiveness for simply existing as it is. But when you begin to observe this without judgment, you gain your power back, because most of your life hasn't been shaped by your choices, but by your fear of how those choices would be perceived. So you shrink, you soften your edges, you wrap your strength in disclaimers and call it humility, but that's not humility, that's fear in disguise. True humility is rooted. It doesn't overreach, but it also doesn't apologize for taking up space. It simply stands, solid, calm, unmoved by the noise around it. When you stop explaining, you give others the chance to experience you as you are, not as the version you think they need. And yes, some will leave, some will question you, some will say you've changed. Let them, because the ones who stay will meet you in that deeper space, the one where truth doesn't need to be explained, only lived. And you'll notice something else. You begin to need less validation, less applause, less permission. Your nervous system recalibrates. Your thoughts become quieter. Your presence grows heavier, not in burden, but in gravity. You start walking through life as if you have nothing to prove because you don't. That's not arrogance, that's maturity. The moment you stop explaining is the moment you start trusting, not just others, yourself. And in that trust, you start building a life that doesn't crumble every time someone misunderstands you. You become your own anchor, your own reference point, your own permission slip. So the next time you feel the urge to over-explain, to justify, to soften a truth that's already clear, pause, breathe, and remember, if it was born from your integrity, It needs no defense. Let it stand, let it echo, let it be misunderstood, and still remain true. There's a door you've been walking past your entire life, not a real door, but an internal one. It appears every time you feel the need to explain yourself, to avoid being judged, to escape discomfort, to keep the peace. You feel it in your chest, a tightening, a flicker of doubt, a quick decision to speak more, to soften what was already whole. That door, it's the threshold between self-protection and self-respect. And most people never cross it. Because to cross it means letting go of the version of you that was designed to be understood by everyone. And that version, though familiar, is also a cage. You learned early that silence could be dangerous. That saying no came with consequences. That existing without a disclaimer invited criticism, distance, rejection. So you adjusted. You became skilled at reading rooms, sensing moods, preemptively explaining yourself before anyone even asked. And yes, that skill protected you at first, but eventually it became the very thing that made you invisible. You became a performer in your own life, always explaining, always anticipating, always reducing yourself to avoid being misunderstood. But what is the cost of being constantly understood if the person they understand is not really you? The Stoics would say, clarity within must matter more than clarity from others. When your inner compass is strong, you don't need every opinion to point north. You begin to walk differently, not arrogantly, but with a quiet conviction that doesn't flinch at misunderstanding. And that's when the shift happens. You say less. You wait before speaking. You stop offering backstories to people who never earned your trust. You stop packaging your soul for easy consumption because you realize if someone can't sit with your silence, they're not ready for your truth. You don't owe them an explanation. You owe yourself the dignity of not needing one. Crossing that internal door isn't dramatic. It doesn't come with applause. It comes with space, stillness, a kind of peace that feels foreign at first because it isn't built on approval but on alignment. So when that moment comes again, that urge to explain, to prove, to be received, pause. Don't reach for more words. Reach for your spine and ask, what part of me believes I need to justify what's already true? Then let that part exhale, not because it was wrong, but because it's finally time to rest. It's easy to forget. Your silence has weight. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of sovereignty. The kind that comes when you no longer owe your life to interpretation. Most people speak to be liked, to be safe, to maintain the illusion that being agreeable is the same as being secure. But the truth? Safety doesn't come from agreement. It comes from clarity, and clarity often requires that you say less. There's a moment, after you state a boundary, after you walk away, after you choose rest over obligation, when the guilt creeps in. It whispers, explain yourself. Make them understand. Don't let them think badly of you. But here's the hard truth. They already decided what they wanted to believe, and no amount of explaining will change a mind that's committed to misunderstanding you. So let them. Let them wonder. Let them gossip. Let them paint you with colors that have nothing to do with your soul, because you're not here to repaint yourself every time someone brings a different brush. You're here to remain whole. The Stoics didn't waste energy on reputation. They trained their peace to live within. They knew explanation without invitation is rarely received as truth. And truth, when offered to the wrong ears, becomes noise. You don't need to fight every narrative. You don't need to interrupt every assumption. Sometimes the most powerful act is to say nothing at all, not out of passivity, but out of presence. Because when you're grounded, you don't chase clarity in others. You become clarity itself. And the people meant for you, they'll feel it. They'll recognize it not in your words, but in your way of being. The calm, the stillness, the unwavering no that doesn't apologize. This isn't detachment, it's depth. It's the kind of inner stability that can't be disturbed by misunderstanding. And yes, at first it's lonely. You'll feel the silence more than ever, but over time that silence becomes sacred. You begin to love it, not as an escape, but as a return to yourself, to your truth, to the version of you that doesn't need to perform to belong. So the next time guilt asks you to explain, pause. Not everything true needs to be defended. Let the silence be your signature. There comes a point where your nervous system begins to crave peace more than approval. At first it's subtle. You cancel a plan and don't explain why. You say no and let it stand. You change direction without writing a full paragraph about how much you've thought it through. And something strange happens. You don't die. The world doesn't end. People survive without your constant disclaimers, and more importantly, and so do you. Better than survive, you feel lighter. Because every time you withhold unnecessary explanation, you reclaim energy you didn't even know you were spending. It's not that words are wrong, it's that not all words are rooted in truth. Some are rooted in fear, in self-doubt, in a desperate need to be perceived as good. But good, by whose definition? You were not born to be understood by everyone. You were born to live in integrity, which often looks like mystery to those who don't know your path. Let them not know. Let them wonder. Let them assume things you no longer feel the need to correct. This isn't coldness, it's clarity. The Stoics understood this. They practiced restraint, not to impress, but to remain in command of their own peace. And that's what this is about. Command, not control over others, but over yourself. The more you explain, the more you leak that command. You hand it over with every unnecessary justification. You trade your stillness for a moment of external comfort that never lasts. But when you stay silent, not from fear, but from wholeness, you remain in your center. You become unshakable. And slowly, you begin to see self-respect doesn't require an audience. It doesn't beg for understanding. It doesn't need applause or alignment from the outside. It just is, solid, quiet, present. So when the urge rises to explain who you are, what you believe, why you're different, try something new. Pause, smile, and say nothing. Let the silence hold you. Let it speak the words your soul already knows. Because you are not a press release. You are not a product to be marketed and clarified. You are a presence, and presence needs no permission. There's a quiet shift that happens when you finally realize not everyone deserves access to your explanation. Not because you're better, not because they're lesser, but because explanation is intimacy. And you've been giving that intimacy to people who never valued your clarity, only your compliance. Think about it. How often have you explained yourself not to connect, but to survive, to avoid being labeled, to keep the peace, to dodge the sting of rejection? That's not explanation, that's negotiation disguised as vulnerability. You weren't sharing, you were bargaining, and deep down, you knew it. You could feel the difference between speaking from truth and speaking from fear. The first leaves you lighter, the second leaves you hollow. It's time to stop giving away your depth to people who only listen to refute, reshape, or reduce. There is a dignity in keeping certain things unspoken, not hidden, not secret, just sacred. The Stoics understood this well. They spoke less, not to appear wise, but to avoid wasting energy on minds not ready for real dialogue. Because some ears don't want to hear you. They want to manage you, fit you into a narrative where you're easier to dismiss, easier to forgive, easier to forget. But you're not here to be digestible. You're here to be whole. And wholeness doesn't apologize for its sharp edges. It doesn't explain itself to stay likable. It doesn't shrink just to be understood. It stands quietly, fully, without edits. So the next time someone asks, "Why are you like this? Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you come?" Pause and ask yourself, Do they want to understand or do they want control? Because your energy was never meant to be spent repeating yourself to people who only listen to argue. Real connection doesn't need a pitch. It doesn't require a perfect explanation. It simply recognizes the resonance between souls that are ready to meet without performance. So today, choose sacred silence over shallow justification. Let them think you're distant. Let them assume you're cold. Let them misread your peace as arrogance. Their discomfort is not your emergency, and your truth was never up for debate. There's something sacred about not responding, not ignoring, but choosing presence over persuasion. It's a discipline few practice, because silence can feel like exposure. You say nothing, and suddenly every voice in your head starts questioning your choice. Should I clarify? Will they misunderstand me? Will they think I don't care? But here's the paradox. The more you explain, the more invisible you become. Because over time, people don't hear your words. They hear your fear. They hear that you doubt yourself. And they start mirroring that doubt back to you. It becomes a loop. You explain to be safe, but every explanation weakens the message underneath. It doesn't build trust. It dilutes it, and so you end up misunderstood anyway, but now exhausted too. The Stoics practiced what they called ataraxia, an unshakable calm born from inner stability, not because they were cold, but because they knew. No explanation can substitute the clarity of living with integrity. You don't owe answers to every question. You don't owe proof of your goodness. You owe yourself the peace of standing tall even when others don't get it, especially then, because that's when the real test begins. Can you stay grounded when misunderstood? Can you remain still when accused? Can you choose truth over likability? You'll know you're growing when you feel the urge to explain and you don't, not from pride, not from ego, but from alignment. Because you've realized those who need an explanation to respect you were never offering respect. They were offering transaction, and your soul was not made for transaction. It was made for truth, for depth, for spaces where silence isn't awkward, it's understood. So when someone asks you to make it make sense, don't. Let it remain unclear to those not ready. Let it remain uncomfortable to those who demand neatness instead of honesty. You are not here to translate your life into digestible sound bites. You are here to live it, fully, quietly, and without compromise. And in doing so, you give others the permission to do the same. Some of the most powerful moments in your life will be the ones where you say nothing. Not because you don't have words, but because you finally realize you don't need them. That conversation you didn't continue, that accusation you didn't defend, that message you left unanswered. These aren't acts of weakness, they're signals of alignment. You've spent years trying to manage how others see you. And in doing so, you've neglected how you see yourself. Because every time you explain your truth to be accepted, you abandon the part of you that already knows what matters, knows what's right, knows when silence says more than explanation ever could. We live in a world addicted to explanation. We're taught that silence means guilt, that not replying means arrogance, that stillness equals surrender. But not everything needs to be said. Not everything deserves your breath. And most of all, not everything that's true needs to be proven. When you reach this understanding, you move differently. You start responding to energy, not to questions. You begin filtering requests through your own alignment, not their urgency. And you stop assuming that just because someone doesn't understand you, you owe them your peace in return. Let's be clear, explanation is a gift, not a right, not a demand, and not everyone has earned it. So today, when you feel the urge to justify, pause, breathe. Ask yourself, is this coming from fear or from presence? Because when your life is rooted in presence, you don't fear being misunderstood. You expect it, and you make peace with it. You no longer perform to keep people comfortable. You no longer shrink to stay digestible. You simply exist, honestly, softly, silently. And that silence, it begins to speak for you. People start feeling it, your boundaries, your convictions, your clarity, not because you explained them, but because you embodied them. The Stoics didn't believe in loud declarations. They believed in consistent action, in quiet fortitude, in a life that explained itself through how it was lived, not how it was justified. So maybe your next act of power is not in saying something deeper, but in saying nothing at all. Let your life speak. Let your silence anchor. Let your presence echo what words never could. There's a kind of peace that doesn't come from being heard, but from not needing to be. At first, it feels unnatural. You're used to explaining, to smoothing every edge, to filling the silence before it becomes too loud. But then one day, you stop. You say what needs to be said, and leave it there. No follow-up, no elaboration, no softening, and something shifts inside you, not immediately, but quietly. You realize your truth doesn't depend on someone else's ability to receive it. It's valid, even if it's rejected. It's whole, even if it's misunderstood. You don't have to translate your boundaries into a language someone else prefers. You don't have to perform clarity for those who listen only to respond. You just have to be clear within yourself. That's where the power lives, not in what you explain, but in what you embody. The Stoics knew this. They trained themselves to respond to truth, not noise. They didn't chase understanding, they cultivated it within. Because once you anchor in truth, you stop handing out pieces of yourself just to be seen. You stop sacrificing stillness for approval. You stop offering your soul as evidence. And in doing so, you reclaim your life. Piece by piece, moment by moment, silence by silence. So ask yourself, how much of your energy has gone into managing perception? How much of your time has been spent rehearsing answers to questions no one asked? Or worse, questions that came from someone's projection, not your reality? And what would it feel like to stop, to let your no be a complete sentence, to let your absence speak louder than any excuse, to let your peace be more important than someone else's comfort? It's not easy, but it's necessary. Because the longer you explain, the more you postpone the version of you that doesn't need to anymore, the version that breathes deeply after saying less, the version that smiles at misunderstanding, not because it doesn't hurt, but because it no longer controls you. That's freedom, and it begins with one brave decision: to speak only when speaking feels like honoring your truth, not begging for space. Some people will never understand you, not because you're too complex, but because they're not willing to sit in the silence that reveals who you are. And that's okay. You weren't made to be fully understood by every passing soul. You were made to live truthfully, even if that truth is misread, mistranslated, or ignored. The urge to explain is often the final echo of a wound asking, will they still love me if they don't get it? But love based on understanding is fragile, because people change. Their opinions shift. Their capacity evolves. What stays is how you hold yourself when no one claps, when no one nods, when no one agrees. That's where self-trust is born. In the dark, in the quiet, in the space where you no longer ask the world to validate your path. The Stoics didn't avoid hardship, they trained for it. They knew that discomfort was a better teacher than praise, and that silence, when embraced, becomes not a void, but a mirror. A mirror that asks, are you willing to stand by yourself even when your voice shakes? Even when your choices confuse others, even when your peace is mistaken for pride? If the answer is yes, you're already free, because now your clarity is no longer rented from the opinions of others. It's owned, deeply, quietly, fully. And that kind of ownership doesn't need to shout. It doesn't rush to explain. It simply is. So when the next question comes, why didn't you come? Why did you change? Why aren't you the same? Let your breath be the answer. Let your silence be the explanation. You are not here to narrate your every step to those watching from the sidelines. You are here to walk, to evolve, to stay aligned with what your soul knows, even when it's inconvenient to everyone else. And yes, people will project. They will assume. They will invent stories to make sense of your growth. Let them. You don't owe them a revised version of your becoming, because the real ones, they will feel it, they will see the integrity in your silence, they will recognize the sacred restraint in your lack of performance. And those who don't, they were never meant to walk with you anyway. There's a quiet moment after you stop explaining, when everything feels still, no backtracking, no overthinking, no desperate need to be understood, just you and the silence. And something inside you saying, this is who I am. Not the version shaped by someone else's expectations, not the edited draft meant to earn acceptance, but the whole, unfiltered self that no longer seeks to be digestible. That version of you isn't loud. It doesn't try to dominate. It doesn't need to convince. It just exists, rooted, simple, free. And maybe for the first time in your life, you realize you don't have to explain your peace to anyone. You don't have to justify your distance, your healing, your changes. The people who truly see you will never need the full story to honor your evolution. And the people who demand it, they're not listening, they're evaluating. Let them. Because your silence is not a threat. It's not a wall, it's a doorway back to yourself. You've spent enough time translating your truth into languages that left you voiceless. Now it's time to speak in your native tongue. Silence, stillness, self-respect. You no longer need to wrap your choices in comforting narratives. You no longer have to carry the emotional labor of making others comfortable with your truth. Because that truth isn't negotiable, and your peace, it's not a performance, it's a practice. The Stoics taught us that freedom isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of clarity in the midst of it. You don't escape the storm by yelling louder. You become the eye within it, still, centered, untouched by the wind of opinions and assumptions. So today, do less, say less, defend less, prove less, and live more. Breathe deeper, stand firmer. Because sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is nothing but hold your truth without explanation. Let the silence say what words never could. Let your life speak louder than your defenses ever did. Every time you explain yourself to be accepted, you leave a part of yourself behind. A glance, a breath, a quiet knowing that you chose comfort over truth. And maybe no one notices. You smile, you nod, you say the right things. But later, when you're alone, you feel it. A slight regret, a subtle ache, like something inside you was left unheard. That's the cost of living explained. You become fluent in everyone else's language, but forget your own. And eventually you confuse being understood with being seen. But they're not the same. Being understood means someone gets your words. Being seen means someone holds your essence without needing those words. That kind of presence is rare. And it doesn't come from how much you say. It comes from how deeply you stand in what you don't say. The Stoics knew this. They lived their values, not their justifications. They didn't seek to persuade those who weren't ready. They focused on mastery within, on the kind of alignment that makes explanation irrelevant. Because when you embody your truth, you no longer argue it. You no longer shrink it. You no longer wrap it in ribbons to make it more palatable. You walk into a room and let your energy speak. Let your posture tell the story. Let your decisions say everything. This isn't arrogance, it's emotional sobriety. It's what happens when you've lived long enough in the noise and finally choose the weight of silence. A silence that isn't empty, but full. Full of boundaries, full of discernment, full of peace earned through stillness. So when the moment comes, and it will, when someone challenges your decision, pressures your boundary, questions your path. Breathe. Don't rush in with explanations. Don't dilute your clarity for someone who won't value it. Instead, stand. Not as a statue, but as a presence. Alive, grounded, real. Let them sit with their discomfort. Let them feel the space your silence creates. Because that space, it's where the truth lives. There's a quiet kind of strength most people never talk about. It's not in how loudly you speak, but in how little you need to. It's the strength of the person who no longer feels obligated to clarify what's already clear inside them, who no longer replays conversations just to find a better explanation, who no longer walks away from interactions feeling the need to fix the impression, because that impression, it belongs to them, not to you. And when you begin to truly understand that, your nervous system exhales. You stop micromanaging perception. You stop anticipating reactions. You stop offering yourself on the altar of being liked. And you start living fully, on your terms, in your rhythm, with your voice intact. The Stoics weren't silent because they had nothing to say. They were silent because they knew not every thought deserves a voice, and not every truth needs to be spoken to have weight. They chose presence over persuasion, and that presence, rooted in discipline and clarity, spoke volumes. You don't need a crowd to witness your transformation. You don't need applause to confirm your growth. You just need to stop interrupting your own becoming with explanations that serve no one. Ask yourself, how many times have you shared your reasons, your plans, your truth, only to feel more drained afterward? That's a signal, a moment of recognition. Not every explanation is an act of connection. Some are acts of self-abandonment. Because sometimes, when you explain yourself, you're not reaching out, you're reaching away from your own certainty. Let that stop here. Start allowing your silence to hold what doesn't need to be defended. Let your peace be enough evidence. Let your boundaries be lived, not debated. Let your decisions carry the quiet weight of someone who trusts their own path. You won't be easy to understand, but that's never been the goal. You'll be easy to feel, and those who are meant to feel it will, without the words, without the reasons, without the need for more. Just presence, unapologetic, uncompromised, and finally, undisturbed. There's a moment in every path of growth when you stop needing people to understand you, not out of bitterness, not out of pride, but because you've seen how often understanding is a request for comfort, not connection. They don't really want to know you. They want you to fit the version of you that makes sense in their story. And when you don't, they get uncomfortable, they ask questions, they pressure explanations, not because they care about your truth, but because your truth disrupts their assumptions. That disruption is sacred. Let it stand. You don't have to soften so others feel safe around your evolution. You don't have to narrate every step of your healing, your becoming, your direction. You can simply be, quietly, completely, without justification. The Stoics taught that a wise person is slow to speak, quick to observe, and anchored in what cannot be taken away. Your clarity, when truly yours, cannot be negotiated. It does not change because someone else feels uneasy. It does not shrink to fit into a fragile conversation. It holds, even in silence, especially in silence. So when someone presses for answers, why aren't you the same? What happened to you? Why won't you explain? Let them sit in their own question. You are not here to ease their confusion at the expense of your peace, because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away without a word, not to punish, but to protect. Not just yourself, but the sacred ground you've worked so hard to rebuild. You don't owe anyone the broken-down version of who you used to be just so they can feel familiar again. You've changed, and that change deserves silence. The kind of silence that doesn't beg to be understood, but radiates truth in every step. So from now on, let your silence be a boundary. Let it be your answer. Let it be the end of conversations that never honored your voice. And in that quiet, you'll find something most never do. A peace that doesn't explain itself. A clarity that walks unaccompanied. A life that no longer needs to prove it's worthy to be lived in full. There's something most people never learn. You don't have to explain your peace to anyone who didn't help you find it. That sentence alone can shift the way you walk through the world. Because up until now, you may have spent years trying to justify your healing, your quietness, your boundaries. You tried to make it look gentle, tried to phrase it in ways that didn't sound too firm, tried to wrap your no in enough softness to make it more acceptable. But here's the truth, your healing was never meant to be digestible. It was meant to be honest, and honesty sometimes sounds like silence, sometimes it looks like distance, sometimes it feels like disappointment to others, especially those who only loved the version of you that stayed small and explained everything. Let's stop right here. Let's name it. Over-explaining isn't just a habit, it's a trauma response. A learned behavior rooted in the fear that if people don't understand you, they'll leave. And maybe for a long time, that fear was true. Maybe they did leave when you showed up whole. Maybe they pulled away when you stopped making yourself easier to be around. But they didn't leave because you were too much. They left because your growth was a mirror they weren't ready to look into. The Stoics would tell you, your task is not to make your life acceptable to others. Your task is to live in accordance with nature, and your nature isn't noise, it's depth, it's presence, it's stillness. You've outgrown the need to convince anyone of who you are. You've lived through enough to know that your worth is not up for committee vote. So what now? Now, you stop performing. You stop chasing closure from people who would never understand your opening. You stop offering paragraphs to people who never deserved a single line. And you begin. You begin walking with your head a little higher, not from ego, but from alignment. You begin holding space for your silence, not as a gap in the conversation, but as the conversation itself. Because silence, when chosen with intention, becomes a statement. It says, I'm not here to be fixed. I'm not here to be explained. I'm not here to fit your expectations. I'm here to live, to rest, to exist fully without auditioning for acceptance. You are not too quiet. You are not distant. You are just done negotiating your peace with people who think your soul needs subtitles. You've seen what happens when you trade clarity for comfort, and you're no longer willing to pay that price. So, from this moment forward, speak when it strengthens your center. Stay silent when it protects your wholeness. And when someone asks, but why didn't you say something? You can smile gently and let the silence answer for you, because not everything needs to be said. Some things just need to be lived. When you finally stop explaining, you'll notice something unsettling at first. The space, the stillness, the absence of reaction, no immediate reassurance, no one rushing in to say, it's okay, I understand. Just quiet. It's tempting to fill it, to soften the boundary you just set, to offer just one more sentence. A gentle follow-up to ease the discomfort you didn't cause. But stay with it. Stay in that quiet. Because this is the moment where you begin to reclaim yourself. The self that didn't need to be translated. The self that was never meant to be explained into acceptability. You see, most people fear being misunderstood because they confuse it with rejection. But misunderstanding is not rejection. It's simply space. Space between one person's perception and your truth. And not everyone will cross that space. Not everyone should. The ones who truly care, they won't need the whole story. They'll sense the integrity in your presence. They'll feel the honesty in what you didn't say. Because silence, when it comes from alignment, feels like truth to the right people. And to the wrong ones, no explanation would have ever been enough anyway. The Stoics taught us that most suffering comes not from what happens, but from our resistance to it. You've been resisting the silence. You've feared what it might reveal. But the truth is, that silence has been waiting to return you to yourself. Every time you explained out of fear, you fractured a little more, not because you lied, but because you left yourself to be received. Now, you're learning to stay inside your body even when others walk away, to stay inside your truth even when it's met with confusion or discomfort. That is power, not the kind that dominates, but the kind that doesn't disappear in the face of misunderstanding. And that power, it's quiet. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't prove. It doesn't rush in with clarifications. It simply holds, like stone, like roots, like someone who finally realized you don't owe the world a version of yourself that makes them feel better about themselves. You don't exist to manage their emotions. You don't exist to play interpreter between your truth and their comfort zone. You exist to be whole, and wholeness rarely needs explanation. So the next time the silence comes, don't resist it. Let it stay. Let it settle around you like armor. Let it remind you that your peace was never meant to be spoken into approval, only lived into being. There's something deeply liberating in watching a conversation unfold and knowing you don't have to enter it. You don't have to defend yourself. You don't have to correct the misunderstanding. You don't have to offer context to protect your image. You can just observe, breathe, stay inside your own frame. That frame, it took years to build. Years of undoing patterns that taught you love must be earned, respect must be explained, and silence means guilt. But now you know, not all questions require answers. Not every opinion is worthy of a response. Not every request for just a quick explanation is made in good faith. Some people ask because they feel entitled to access, not because they care to understand. Let them ask. Let them form their theories, fill in the blanks with fiction, and whisper their conclusions in rooms you no longer enter. That's not your business anymore, because peace is expensive. And the price is this: letting go of your addiction to being understood. It's an addiction few name, but it's real, and it keeps so many people stuck in cycles of self-abandonment. They keep talking even after the soul has gone quiet. They keep explaining even after clarity has been reached. They keep oversharing as a way to be loved in pieces instead of being accepted in full. And they call it connection. But it's not. Connection without boundaries is exposure. It's giving without discernment. It's bleeding in places that were never meant to hold your healing. The Stoics taught that wisdom is knowing the difference between what belongs to you and what belongs to the world. Your truth, it belongs to you. Your peace, it belongs to you. Your alignment, your stillness, your refusal to engage in unnecessary drama, all of it is yours to protect. And that protection often looks like silence, not silence from fear, not silence as a strategy, but silence as your native language, the one you return to when all the noise loses meaning. Because at the end of the day, you don't find peace by being louder than the chaos. You find peace by being unmoved by it. You let the world spin, let the narratives twist, let the misunderstandings pile up. You stay centered, you stay quiet, you stay whole, and one day you look back and realize how much of your suffering was rooted in trying to be legible to people who never intended to read you. Now you no longer write yourself into their story. You write your life in silence, in actions, in how you walk away without slamming the door, in how you breathe instead of respond, in how you choose peace over proving. Let that be enough. Let that be everything. If you've come this far, it wasn't by accident. Something in you was ready for this silence, ready to stop performing, ready to stop apologizing for being a quieter kind of powerful. Maybe you didn't even know how deeply exhausted you were from defending your intentions, from softening your truth, from over-explaining your peace to people who never intended to hold it. But now, there's space. Not the kind that isolates, the kind that invites you back to yourself. Because something happens when you stop explaining. You begin listening, not to others, to you. You hear the sound of your own truth again. You hear the clarity that doesn't tremble. You hear the boundary that doesn't need punctuation. You hear your breath steady, unbothered, whole. That's what all of this was about. Not silence for silence's sake, but silence as return, silence as clarity, silence as command. You don't need to go back. You don't need to reach out. You don't need to fix the misunderstanding that lives in someone else's mind. Let it live there. You have no duty to renovate thoughts that were never grounded in truth. You've spent enough time trying to be palatable. Now, it's time to be real. The Stoics would say, the more you seek validation, the more you betray your nature, but the more you live in accordance with yourself, the less the noise matters. You've seen the noise, you've lived in it, you've performed inside it, and now you're stepping out of it. This exit won't be loud. There will be no curtain call. No one may notice at first, but you will, in how you sleep, in how you walk, in how you no longer shrink before making a decision, in how your no becomes a resting place instead of a battlefield. You will feel the shift. It will feel like power, like returning to the spine you thought you had to bend to be loved. Now you know, the people who needed your explanation to respect you were never offering respect. The people who required your softness to stay were never strong enough to remain. And the version of you who kept explaining was doing the best they could with what they knew. So don't shame them, thank them, and then let them go, because you're not that anymore. You're quieter now, but heavier, more grounded, less available, more whole. You don't speak to be heard. You speak when it's aligned. You speak when it's true, and you're silent when the moment calls for presence instead of noise. That is self-trust. That is dignity. That is peace. So if something in this journey echoed within you, don't rush to respond. Sit with it. Breathe with it. Let it settle in your bones, and maybe, in your own way, leave something behind. Not to explain yourself, not to be seen, but as a quiet trace for someone else who might be walking this path, silently too. A word, a pause, a breath in the form of text, because sometimes what saves us is not being understood, but remembering we were never meant to live explained. You were meant to live real, and that finally is enough.